Can you hear me?
Yes.
Even in the back there?
Even in the back.
Ada's not straining. Okay. Thank you all for coming. This is a great crowd, and so many of my favorite writers who ever lived are in the room, so I won't even start naming. You honor me by showing up. I've got two scenes. I think I've got time to do both short scenes from a new story that is unfinished. Don't expect closure. Michael Swanwick taught me something years ago. He said, when you're doing a public reading and you hit the page break, take a drink of water. So you will see me do that at least once. So come in, come in. I should have rehearsed the title, which I don't usually try to do. The title of this story, it will be, Criswell Predicts! Still working on that. Steep and rocky was the way to the oracle, and even Archippus, master of horses, had no choice but to ascend on foot. But he had spent as much time chasing and roping horses as riding them, and so he was lean and strong and knew how to live but lightly off the land. Along the path grew capers and wild greens, and springs of water burbled from the hillside. In his bag he carried only olives, bread, and figs, and his bedroll rode easily across his shoulders. On the third day he met an old woman who was headed, as women will, in the opposite direction. From a distance he thought she was a boy, so recklessly did she skip and scramble downhill. She brought herself up short before him. An oak shade you, he told her, and a beech nourish you, she replied. Got any figs? He traded 3 figs for a lump of cheese, sharp and stinking, which Archippus savored on his tongue. The old woman gobbled the figs, but took her time digging the skins from her teeth, then eating them. She sat on a flat rock, her bony knees glinting in the sun. Do you seek the oracle then? She asked. I do, said Archippus. She smiled and shook her head. You will be surprised, she said. The priest is strange. As all priests are, he replied. No, she said. This one, she stopped, considering. He is not like other priests, she said. His words, my question, nothing matched. Archippus could not, of course, ask her to repeat the substance of her question or her answer. That would have been a rudeness. But he was pleased that she seemed content. He said, all oracles speak in riddles. This was no riddle, said the old woman. I mean, I understood it, but I do not know why I understood it. She shook herself as if waking from a dream, grasped her staff two-handed and stood. And now I go home, she said, to clout my worthless nephew and sell Carpos all my sheep and begin my life anew. The roots enfold you, and the leaves sing you to sleep, said Archippus, who watched bemused as her billowing cloak grew steadily smaller downslope. A strange priest for a strange pilgrim, he thought, as he wiped his lips on his cloak. Good cheese, though. The sun was setting when Archippus reached the edge of the mountaintop. Before him the ridge was windswept and bare, but for the sacred grove on the horizon, one tremendous oak in the middle, flanked by 2 smaller ones on either side. He was too far yet to see the vessels hanging from the branches, but the breeze carried in their tinkles and clanks. Archippus gauged what remained of the light, then retreated a few paces, unrolled his bed, and went immediately to sleep. Oracles worked best in the morning. Everyone knew that. At sunrise he drank his fill from the nearest rivulet, lest he be tempted into blasphemy by the sacred spring, and walked the last half mile to the grove, the last few yards on his hands and knees. Some oracles were attended by a half-dozen priests, but the oracle of Dodonia had only one. A cloaked figure sat, head bowed, amid the thick, gnarled root fingers of the tallest oak. His face, or hers, was in shadow. Above, 100, 1,000, 10,000 brass vessels of all shapes and sizes hung thick from the branches, clanking together constantly, like a column on the march. The vessels conversed in an endless metallic murmur. As Archippus crawled closer in the thick grass, the priest sat motionless, without acknowledgement. Finally, Archippus stopped. Any closer, and he would be crawling into the priest's lap, which hardly seemed wise. He waited a decent interval, and then spoke. "O priest of Dodonia, I wish to ask a question of the oracle, she who sees far and knows all." No response. Eventually, Archippus cleared his throat and repeated himself a bit more loudly. No response. Maybe he hadn't quite debased himself properly. Spreading his arms, he lay on his belly like an adder. Into the mealy earth he said, "O priest of Dodonia, oh my friend," boomed the priest, in a voice that seemed to come from deep within the mountain. "The past has brought you here, but only the future will determine the rest of your life. Oh my friend, whither have you drifted? Whither shall you go? Whither is the answer that you seek?" Up to this point, Archippus in his 30 summers had been afraid of nothing. But he was afraid now, not of the priest or the oracle, but of possibly receiving an answer to his question. Because what he had determined to ask, what he had climbed a mountain to learn, was simple and yet suddenly terrifying. But he had come this far, and oracles did not take well to teasing. Archippus licked his grassy lips, spat, and asked, "O oracle, what will become of me?" A breeze combed the grass, and the hanging vessels sang louder. Archippus twisted his head, looked up from the dirt. The priest, a man, was looking straight at him. His cloak had fallen back, baring his head. His face was as white as a woman's, as if painted with chalk and lead. His hair was pale yellow and curled up from his forehead as if the locks had been stuck in place with honey. A narrow band of black cloth was wrapped around his neck and knotted beneath his chin. And his eyes, Archippus could not look away from his eyes. "Why do you fear the future?" cried the priest. "It will arrive only seconds from now. Can you hear it? Can you see it? Already it is upon you, your incredible future. Yes, my friend, of all the time to be alive, the time is now. Of all the worlds on which to live, the world is yours. Of all the lives open before you, live for your incredible future." The faded sign in the front yard had needed painting for 15 years. It was less a sign than a suggestion, a hint that Mrs. Murphy might be a reader and advisor, and the outline of the poem was that of a ghost. But Velma needed no sign to point her way, as she huffed up the front walk, purse bouncing against her hip. Like all Bootsy Murphy's customers, Velma was a regular. In this line of work, regulars were all you had. Ignoring the bell and the equally faded sign that said, "Please ring here," Velma yanked open the screen door and stepped into the front parlor, yelling, "Hello!" Bootsy yelled from the back, "That you, Velma?" "Honey, it better be." As she yelled, Velma automatically shrugged out of her windbreaker and made a nest for her purse on the hearth of the never-used fireplace. "Shouldn't be leaving your door unlocked this day and age." She plumped into the crowded room's least comfortable chair, the one for customers, that faced Bootsy's rocking chair across the reading table. The table was bare, but for a copy of People with that pregnant princess on the front, and an empty fruit jar that sat naked like a hint. Velma dropped a faded, much folded $20 bill into the jar. She had to keep her Bootsy money separate from the kitchen cash, as Harold didn't hold with wasting money on fortunes. Then she checked her phone to see whether Harold had texted her wondering after 40 years where she kept the jelly. "You don't know who's going to walk in," Velma yelled, big as life, make himself at home. "Go on and have a seat," Bootsy yelled. "I'm trying not to burn my biscuits here." "Ouch! God bless it." No text from Harold, thank God. "I thought I smelled something good," Velma yelled, "and me supposed to be dieting." "You know you want one of these," Bootsy yelled, "diet or no diet." Their conversation was yelled back and forth not because the kitchen was far away, it was a small house, but because the parlor TV was on and at high volume as usual. A good-looking man with a mustache was walking around a cartoon map on the floor, talking about the bad storms that had come through the day before, and the bad storms that would come through at week's end, and the bad storms that were expected next week. He put Velma in mind of Dr. Tyson on Cosmos, which Velma had watched faithfully ever after seeing him on the cover of Parade magazine. She could not follow half of it, and what she could follow was not exactly scriptural, but Dr. Tyson, my oh my. This weather boy just wished he looked that good. "What you baking biscuits for at 2 in the day? Dinner time's over." Carrying them over to the Hamilton's house, Mr. Versey finally passed, you know. Bootsy emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron over her tracksuit and carrying a TV tray with 3 hot biscuits on a plate, a tub of butter, a jar of molasses, and a bread knife. She set it on the reading table before Velma, whose mouth watered. The tracksuit hung loose on Bootsy's narrow butt. Through the years, Velma had noticed that she only got wider, Bootsy only skinnier. But Velma took an obscure satisfaction in this. She liked occupying space. She set to mixing a nice smile of butter into a pool of molasses, whipping it tap, tap, tap into a thick brown puddle for sopping. "Yes, I heard about Mr. Versey at the beauty parlor. Poor old soul, he's better off." Bootsy laughed, perched on the edge of her rocker. "That's what Mama always said, too. He's better off. She's better off." Mama was better off, too, but she still didn't want to go. Hung on like a cat to a carpet, and like to took all of us with her. "Look at you sop those biscuits. You must be country." "You ought to know," Velma said with her thick, buttery tongue, and the old friends both laughed merrily. "Well, what's on your mind today, Velma? What can I see ahead for you?" "It's my granddaughter, LaShawn. You know, Corey's girl." "She's up at the college, isn't she?" "Yeah, but she won't be there long. She can't pass her chemistry class." "Chemistry? I thought she wanted to be a nutrition person. Help old ladies with their diabetes and all." She addressed this to the steadily shrinking pool of molasses. "That's right," Velma said, "but looks like they lay chemistry in front of everybody just to weed them out." "So what I want to know is how LaShawn's midterms are going to come out. Because in December, if she comes home to stay, I know just where she will end up, and that's with me. She don't want none of her daddy's mess." "When's the midterms?" "Next week, I believe." Mighty nearabouts for handwork. Might need the cards. Still, let me see. Velma, honey, get that remote for me and turn down that program, if you will. Velma complied with her left hand as she gave Bootsy her right. Same forecast every day, anyhow. Tornado season in Alabama lasts 12 months anymore. Bootsy said, already focused on Velma's palm. She cradled it and ran a finger lightly across its calluses and creases. I see. She gave Velma a sharp glance over the top of her bifocals. You skipped assembly on Sunday, didn't you? Velma had known since playground days that her friend had the gift, but to this day she was sometimes surprised. "How'd you know that?" Bootsy shrugged. "Miss Margie told me." Down the Piggly Wiggly. "That woman tells everything. The deacons think you're holding out on them, think you're sneaking off to join the Baptists because of that handsome new preacher, they think. Hold still now. I'm just teasing you." A long silence ensued, which Velma did not much mind, as with her free hand she was sopping up the last of the butter and the molasses with the last bit of biscuit. As she licked her fingers, she glanced at Bootsy. The palmist sat motionless in a strange position, her head cocked sideways, her eyes unfocused. Though she still loosely held Velma's hand, she wasn't looking at it. Seemed to be staring instead at a patch of rosebud wallpaper a few inches to the left of the ottoman where her crocheting lay. "Bootsy?" asked Velma. There was no response, but Velma now saw, as she paid closer attention, that Bootsy had begun almost imperceptibly to rock back and forth, as if unconscious of the action. One part of Velma, the silly and never grown-up part, was reminded of the mindlessly rocking paw of the plastic cat beside the register at the Chinese buffet up at the mall. But another part of Velma, the grave and never really young part that always thought something terrible was about to happen, reached an immediate conclusion. Stroke, just like Mr. Versey. She yanked back her hand as if stroke were contagious, and the palmist remained as she had been, frozen, clasping only air. "Bootsy!" cried Velma. "You're scaring me! Say something! Bootsy?" And now Bootsy's mouth began to move, and someone began to speak. But whoever or whatever was speaking, it sure wasn't Bootsy. It was someone with a deep and resonant voice, like Dr. Tyson. It was the voice of a man. "Always the same thing happened, my friends. Only the people are different." Velma screamed. "And yet are we so different, really, as we all stand 10 seconds from eternity?" Now Bootsy's head turned, which meant her blank eyes turned toward Velma, the way turning that plastic Chinese cat meant its eyes had no choice but to turn too. And Bootsy's always perfectly coiffed head of white hair, a do that the beauty parlor gals unkindly called the total George Washington, looked somehow different, like a wig someone would wear to play act at being Bootsy. And her face was different too, longer in the forehead and the chin, the eyes sunken. Velma later would call it a mannish face. And this not Bootsy person, if it was a person, continued to speak in ringing tones that filled the chintzy little parlor with pregnant princess grandeur. "Hear me, Velma Collins. The future must be yours, for it is the only place you will ever live. Now the records can be unsealed. Now the stories can be told. Now the dead can find justice and the living their reward." Whereupon Velma screamed again, and for the first time in her 65 years in this world, fainted. When she came to, she was lying on the cat-smelling carpet, the back of her head bruised and sore, and Bootsy, her old friend from grade school, now completely Bootsy, wholly Bootsy, no one in this world but dear old Bootsy, was kneeling beside her, patting Velma's own limp hand, tears running down her cheeks, saying, "You better come back to me, Velma, you hear? The 911 is coming, don't you worry. Oh my God, you have given me a fright. For a second there, I thought someone was wearing you like a mask. And the things you were saying about riddles of the unexplained and all. Girl, you've been watching too much PBS." And that's all. have time for questions. I have no answers, but we have time for questions.
Andy?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I missed just the first part. Did you say you're writing this for a particular project?
This I think it is bound toward my collection for small beer, if they like it.
I like it.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So did she pass the midterm?
Will she pass?
I think she gets a C-. That's what I see. I have tenure now. I've been teaching undergrads for 20 plus years, and I too have achieved a sort of prescience. When my advisees assure me that everything's going great in organic right now,
How much of the voice, the spirit voice, did you take directly from our pal Criswell?
We should talk about Criswell, because as so often with my stories, it is possible that people just don't know the miscellaneous pop culture excessive background. When I wrote Zora and the Zombie, it never occurred to me for a second that some readers would never have heard of Zora Neale Hurston, but it was so. I saw online conversations where people said, I really love this Andy Duncan story, and I looked it up, and there really was a Zora Neale Hurston. And I said, oh my God, I never would have written the story. It was hubris enough. In this case, I won't say for Graham, because Criswell is not Hurston, but Jerome Criswell King was the happy charlatan, fraudulent TV psychic of Southern California in the 60s. He was on Carson a lot. The only reason we remember him at all is because he befriended, or vice versa, Ed Wood, and joined the Ed Wood stock company. So he's the guy at the beginning of Plan 9 from Outer Space who gives the classic fruity introduction. And he was in a couple of other Wood pictures. And the instigation for this story was for some birthday occasion or something. I finally ordered the first edition copies of his 2 books where he had assembled his random predictions into 2 volumes in the late 60s by a small press in my home state of South Carolina, oddly enough. Although when I read them and saw just how conservative many of the predictions were, and how they were obviously very afraid of urban riots and all this sort of the modern world, I saw why a small press in South Carolina might like it. But the most fun thing for me, and there are passages in those books that are Zen-like in their ludicrousness. And I just so admired them, so as I went, I just made note of all my favorite passages. And then I copied them all out for like 3 pages. And I said, I don't want to use these exact fruity passages because I don't want to run into copyright issues. But I'm just going to write my own fruity passages that do exactly, as near as I can, what the originals did. And so I have a lot of those to sprinkle through. But the narrative, to the extent there is a narrative, there's like, to the extent there's ever a narrative, there's like 2 levels. On one level, there's Criswell keeps breaking into our world at various times whenever one would expect a prediction or an oracle or because we're all being Criswell. When we presume to predict the future, we're all just as absurd as he is, I think. And then the other part of it is the future that Criswell envisioned, trying to use his ravings as a template for science fictional extrapolation. Because people kept saying, why don't you ever write a science fiction story? Because Lawrence Person always comes up to me and says, I really enjoyed your story. Of course it's not science fiction. So I decided, okay, I'm going to write me a science fiction story. See how you like it? That's the part that's not quite ready to read from yet, which is a shame because I do a really good Slim Pickens imitation. You're very kind for all coming. Yes, ma'am.
Have you ever looked into doing audiobooks of your stories? Because you're a fabulous reader.
Well, thank you. I have never, like most anything else that would suggest a professional career, I have never looked into it with any seriousness. But I think that would be fun. The one thing that has always held me up is because so much of any reading is you guys. So much of any reading is the atmosphere in a room and people laughing and the energy bouncing back and forth. I mean, this is an ideal room with the audience and the crowd and the setting. So in the past, when I have tried it, it was just me and a microphone, and it's a very different thing. It also doesn't help that I don't like the sound of my own voice. I imagine something much more attractive than what I actually sound like. So I always wince when I hear. But yes, I need to just get off the stick and do that. Kate Elliott told me that last summer. All sorts of people have told me that.
I told you that last night.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. Byron has said this for a long time.
You could record with an audience.
I could indeed.
Yeah.
Now then, if it's the whole story, I tend to write long stories. They're mostly novelettes. So then we'd have to take breaks and there'd have to be refreshments. You know, there'd be some sort of inducement.
Fritos.
Right, but maybe, you know, maybe some willing convention we would try that as an experiment sometime and see who signed up. Do like a sort of super coffee clutch that would be like, you know, uniquely difficult for the poor souls that signed up for it. 5-minute warning. I think we're okay there. Thank you. So, anything else?
I'm missing something. What's going to make this a science fiction story?
It's Criswell's extrapolation, and I realized as I went through, because I had this initial insane Tim Powers dream of like including every single prediction in the books and wedging them all in there. And of course it's completely contradictory from one page to the next. And it's impossible to wedge them all in there. And some of them are really interesting, but some of them are really cliched. And I thought, oh no, my project is ruined because I can't do this. I would have to like pick and choose arbitrarily. So I went away for like 6 weeks while I like ate and bathed and did other things. And then I realized, but that's what every science fiction writer does. They take the journal, or they take the research, or they take whatever it is, the book they read or whatever, or the scientist they talked to, the symposium they attended, and they pick the 2 or 3 things that really interest them, that inspire the story, and they leave out the rest. They just ignore it. And I thought, oh, of course, it was like a revelation. And it was like the ghost of Charles Sheffield still in his pirate costume from the Baltimore Worldcon all those years ago was like on my shoulder, and he said, well, Andy, what did you expect? You know, what do you think we've been doing? I said, thank you, Charles. Thank you all for coming.